Vermeer's paintings seem so definitive, so perfectly resolved, that there's a tendency to see him as an isolated figure, a painter without a context. I often find this in conversations with people who admire his art. But Vermeer's paintings emerged from a new type of society that existed in the Netherlands in the second half of the 17th century. It was made up of an elite of merchants and it had a larger middle class than other parts of Europe. These people demanded a new type of art, and painters reacted by making new products. One of them was paintings of domestic interiors. This includes Vermeer's works, but also similar pictures by many other artists. In this video we will look at two of them, two Dutch 17th century painters specializing in domestic interiors, Gerard ter Borch and Pieter de Hooch. Ter Borch actually met Vermeer once, even though he was not from Delft. The Netherlands was a small country and it was easy to travel between cities. From about 1645, Ter Borch specialized in scenes such as the one that we see here. This is some 5 years earlier than Vermeer's paintings have similar themes. Ter Borch influenced his younger colleague. He was the first to specialize in this type of image of elegant interiors, with a few figures involved in what appear to be casual activities. The figures here are concentrated in their activities. They're unaware of our presence. They make us feel that we're peering into an intimate, private scene. There was a taste in the Netherlands at this time for poems and texts dealing with women who were both attractive and out of reach. That's exactly the mood that we often find in Ter Borch's paintings. Many of the women in his pictures have the same features. This is because he very often used one of his sisters as a model. The title of this painting is A Young Woman at Her Toilet with a Maid. We need titles to refer to paintings, to know what we're talking about. But in the vast majority of the cases, titles were not given by the authors. They appeared when paintings were first documented in inventories of collections or catalogs of sales, or when they entered museums. In this other painting we see Ter Borch's mastery when painting fabrics, especially satin. Many paintings of domestic interiors, by Ter Borch and other Dutch specialists, include young men and women. In some cases, the presence of musical instruments, unmade beds in the background, playing cards or other elements identified with indecent behavior indicate that the scenes deal with the theme of love and the promise of sex. But in many cases we're left guessing. That's what happens here. A young man with a sword hanging from his belt shares a room with two young women. He directs his gesture towards one of them, whose face we don't see. We don't know what they're talking about, but it's easy to see this as a scene of some kind of courtship. In the 18th century this was named parental admonition, as if the man was the father of the woman that we see from the back. This is highly unlikely. Pieter de Hooch is the other main precedent for Vermeer. He worked in Delft during his youth, until he left Amsterdam in 1660. Delft had 25,000 inhabitants at the time. He and Vermeer must have known each other. De Hooch's early interior scenes are a few years earlier than Vermeer's. They show middle-class interiors, with figures most often involved in homely duties. Here we see a woman, dressed in modest clothes, which may imply that she's a maid. She's handing a jar over to a boy. Through a door we see a room with a chair on a platform. It's meant to keep it from the damp and cold floor. Above is a portrait of the absent man of the house. Spatial clarity, views of adjacent spaces, and a preference for earth tones are characteristic of this artist. De Hooch was not as good at painting figures as Vermeer or Ter Borch, but he makes up for this by the tenderness with which he portrays domestic life. Another very attractive feature of this artist is his taste for unpolished, rough textures. In De Hooch we find something that we don't see in paintings by his Dutch peers, a taste for the wear and tear of everyday life. Originally a painting hung on the wall behind the woman, just above her head. You can see it better in this detail, above the head of the woman and above the door. After including it in the scene, De Hooch decided to remove it. Even though they look very realistic, paintings of domestic interiors made in the Netherlands in the 17th century are very carefully designed. This is another painting by De Hooch, painted around 1660. The light that comes in from the background, The spatial geometry and the range of colors are characteristic of the artist. In the foreground is a woman preparing bread and butter for a child, presumably her son. He seems to be praying. Behind the door is a building with a sign that says Skole, or school. That must be where the boy is preparing to go. Between the room in the foreground and the street outside is another room where we can see the silhouette of a man, presumably the father. This painting is like a diagram of what life should be like in the minds of 17th century Dutchmen. It expresses an ideal of domestic life based on maternal care, which will prepare the child for his future in the outside world. To me, the beauty of the paintings of domestic interiors has to do with how they did so much with so little, with noticing the difference between the particular key of each artist, the stylized figures and beautiful surfaces of Ter Borch, for example, or the traces of life in the textures of de Hooch, or the sense of timeless perfection in Vermeer. But for contemporaries they must have also seemed radically new. They put their own time and place center stage. The difference in subject matter from traditional mainstream art must have seemed conspicuous and exciting to them.